Introduction. To exist as a fighter pilot is to live permanently on a razor's edge, balancing the accumulation of thousands of micro-decisions against the constant proximity of a fiery death. In this unforgiving environment, a single miscalculation can unravel a mission, a reality underscored by a test flight over the Korean peninsula in a stripped-down F-16. The aircraft, fresh from maintenance and devoid of the usual drag-inducing missiles and fuel tanks, was effectively a high-performance hot rod prepared for a maximum speed run. Launching alone, the pilot pushed the throttle past the stops and rotated it into afterburner, dumping fuel directly into the exhaust to ignite a 30-foot flame that pinned him to his seat. As the jet climbed into the thinning atmosphere, the sky deepened from blue to indigo, revealing the curvature of the Earth and the geography of the Yellow Sea below. At 50,000 feet, the aircraft accelerated past Mach 1.4, tearing through the sky at over 1,000 miles per hour. To squeeze every ounce of speed from the dwindling fuel reserves, the pilot initiated a dive, watching the analog gauges wend toward their limits. But at Mach 1.6, the smooth rush of speed disintegrated into violent shaking. The air resistance, exerting force hundreds of times greater than highway driving, caused the aluminum alloy wings to flutter, sending unsustainable vibrations shuddering through the airframe. In that precarious moment, with the aircraft threatening to disintegrate and the pilot well outside safe ejection parameters, a memory surfaced from the secure vault of the fighter squadron. An experienced pilot named Saigon had once recounted a counterintuitive lesson from a test program. Pushing through the turbulence by going faster could alter the resonance and dampen the vibration. Faced with the choice to slow down and stress the airframe or accelerate into the unknown, the pilot chose speed. As the dial ticked past Mach 1.9, the violence abruptly ceased, replaced by an eerie calm and the radiant heat of friction warming the cockpit glass, proving that in the high-stakes world of aviation, superior judgment is the only fail-safe against physics. This harrowingly thin margin for error is what defines aviation culture. In the industry's infancy, the default outcome of flight was often catastrophe, a reality that necessitated an obsessive focus on decision-making. By ruthlessly analyzing every crash to find its root cause, aviation transformed from a perilous gamble into a system where commercial fatalities are statistical anomalies. Air combat layers an additional dimension of chaos onto this physics problem, introducing an adaptive enemy actively seeking to exploit vulnerabilities through deception and technology. In this arena, survival depends on the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act, a continuous cycle of processing incomplete information to outmaneuver threats ranging from hypersonic missiles to stealth interceptors. However, the necessity of making high-quality decisions under pressure extends far beyond the cockpit. In a world where technology acts as a force multiplier, a single decision by a CEO, a surgeon, or a first responder can have disproportionate leverage-amplified consequences, widening the gap between success and disaster. Despite the critical nature of judgment, traditional education rarely teaches the divergent thinking required to navigate the messy uncertainty of the real world. To bridge this gap, the methodologies honed by the U.S. Air Force, an organization that invests millions in training a single pilot, can be distilled into a universal framework known as the ACE helix. This concept visualizes decision-making not as a linear path, but as a dynamic spiral, much like the geometry of a dogfight or a strand of DNA, where conditions constantly evolve. The process begins with assessment, breaking down complex problems to identify tipping points and power laws. It transitions to choosing, where instincts are codified, and fast forecasting allows for rapid mental modeling of unseen scenarios. Finally, it moves to execution, prioritizing tasks to free up mental bandwidth and managing the human biases and emotions that threaten to cloud judgment. By mastering these pillars, one can move from reactive struggling to deliberate, effective action, turning the chaotic influx of daily challenges into a manageable series of prioritized choices. This transformation is not theoretical, but practical, born from a lineage of pilots who have maintained air superiority for decades by adhering to the principle that clear decision-making beats raw talent. As the narrative moves forward, it will dissect the mechanics of the ACE helix, offering a guide to mapping out decisions with the same rigor used to dominate the skies, ensuring that when the pressure mounts, the resulting actions are not products of chance, but of disciplined, trained instinct. Chapter 1. Assess. On the night of May 31st, 2009, Air France Flight 447 departed Rio de Janeiro for Paris, carrying 228 souls into the darkness over the Atlantic. The Airbus A330, a marvel of modern aviation with advanced fly-by-wire systems, designed to prevent pilot error, climbed steadily toward the Intertropical Convergence Zone, a notorious band of thunderstorms near the equator. While other flights diverted around the weather, Flight 447 flew directly into it. Hours later, when the aircraft failed to check in with controllers, a search was launched, eventually discovering wreckage 500 miles off Brazil's coast. The tragedy sparked a 2-year mystery that only deepened when investigators recovered the black boxes from the ocean floor in 2011. What they revealed was not a catastrophic mechanical failure, but a catastrophic failure of judgment rooted in a breakdown of the most fundamental step in decision-making: assessment. In U.S. Air Force pilot training, students endure stand-ups, a high-pressure exercise where they must verbally solve a theoretical emergency in front of their peers. The mantra drilled into them is simple: maintain aircraft control, analyze the situation, take proper action. This sequence prioritizes assessment over immediate reaction. The instinct to act quickly often bypasses the critical step of understanding the problem, leading to convergent thinking, where one rash decision spirals into cascading failures. To combat this, F-16 pilots are taught the unorthodox technique of winding the clock, physically interacting with a useless analog clock in the cockpit to force a momentary pause, allowing the brain to transition from panic to analysis. The cockpit recordings of Flight 447 paint a harrowing picture of what happens when this pause is skipped. The captain, Marc Dubois, had left the flight deck to rest, leaving the inexperienced 32-year-old Pierre-Cédric Bonin in charge, supported by the more experienced but rusty David Robert. As the plane entered the storm, ice crystals clogged the pitot tubes, causing the airspeed indicators to fail. This was a known, manageable issue. Other crews had simply maintained their flight path until the ice melted. However, the loss of airspeed data caused the autopilot to disconnect, thrusting the plane into manual control. Terrified and lacking a clear mental model of the situation, Bonin immediately pulled back on the stick, putting the heavy airliner into a steep climb. This irrational action, taken without assessing the instruments, doomed the flight. The plane climbed rapidly into the thin air until it stalled, falling from the sky at over 10,000 feet per minute. Despite the stall warnings blaring, Bonin kept the stick pulled back, keeping the nose high even as they plummeted, a maneuver likened to a falling leaf. Robert, confused by the conflicting data and unaware of Bonin's inputs due to the unconnected side stick controls, tried to troubleshoot but could not build a coherent picture of the crisis. When Captain Dubois returned to the cockpit, he found chaos. Without the crucial information that Bonin was stalling the plane, even the experienced captain could not solve the puzzle in the remaining seconds. It wasn't until the ocean was rushing up to meet them that Bonin confessed, "I've been at maximum nose up for a while." The realization came too late. Moments later, the aircraft slammed into the Atlantic, disintegrating instantly. The root cause of the crash was a failure to assess. Bonin acted before he understood, and in doing so, he turned a minor instrument malfunction into a fatal disaster. This tragedy underscores the necessity of the cross-check, gathering data from multiple sources to build an accurate mental model before committing to action. Whether in a cockpit or a boardroom, the ability to resist the urge to react blindly and instead win the clock is the difference between solving a problem and becoming a casualty of it. In a complex world saturated with noise, success depends on this disciplined judgment, the ability to sift through chaos, identify the true nature of the problem, and only then execute. Chapter 2. Power Laws. In the high-speed, high-stakes environment of fighter combat, the margin between a successful maneuver and catastrophe is often dictated by an intuitive grasp of nonlinear physics. This was vividly illustrated during a training mission over the Arizona desert, where a new F-16 pilot found himself merging at over 1,000 miles per hour with an adversary, a seasoned colonel with combat experience. As the jets passed, the pilot rolled inverted and pulled back on the stick, subjecting his body to 9 times the force of gravity. Despite the G-suit squeezing his legs and his own practice straining maneuver, his vision narrowed to a tunnel as blood drained from his brain. Pinned to his seat by 2,000 pounds of force, he fought to keep sight of the enemy while managing the complex systems of his aircraft. The engagement quickly transitioned into a vertical climb. The colonel, executing a superior tactic, pulled straight up, trailing a vapor cloud from the intense pressure changes. The student pilot, trailing slightly in airspeed, 5 knots too slow, decided to match the maneuver, assuming the small deficit would be negligible. This assumption was a fatal miscalculation rooted in linear thinking. As the jet climbed, its speed bled off until it reached the top of the loop with 0 airspeed. Gravity overcame thrust, and the 30,000-pound aircraft began to slide backward, a condition the F-16 was never designed to handle. The flight computers, sensing the impossible parameters, screamed warnings as the nose snapped down violently, subjecting the pilot to negative G-forces that lifted him out of his seat against the harness. Blood rushed to his head, red-out vision setting in as loose items in the cockpit became projectiles. The jet, now falling like a leaf in a figure-8 motion, was out of control and plummeting toward the mountains below. The pilot, fighting panic, executed the emergency recovery checklist: throttle to idle, override the flight controls, and rock the stick to build momentum. Finally, the nose fell through, allowing him to engage the afterburner and pull out of the dive just thousands of feet above the terrain. The near disaster was a direct result of failing to respect the nonlinear nature of aerodynamics. A small input error led to a disproportionately massive loss of control. This principle extends far beyond aviation. Humans are cognitively biased toward linear thinking, assuming that inputs and outputs scale proportionally. However, the world is governed by power laws, where relationships are exponential, diminishing, or follow a long tail. A classic example is the penny doubling problem. Most people intuitively guess that a penny doubling daily for a month yields a few $100s, when the actual answer is over $10 million. Similarly, fuel efficiency is nonlinear. Upgrading a 10 mpg truck to 20 mpg saves far more gas than upgrading a 20 mpg car to 50 mpg, despite the smaller numerical increase. Recognizing these knees in the curve, tipping points where behavior shifts radically, is essential for accurate assessment. The business world provides a stark case study in the failure to recognize power laws. In 1997, the founders of Excite.com, a dominant web portal, met with Larry Page and Sergey Brin, Stanford students who had developed a revolutionary search algorithm called backrub. Excite's CEO, viewing the internet through a linear lens, believed that manually curated content and existing search technology were sufficient. He rejected the students' offer to sell their algorithm for $750,000, fearing it was too good and would reduce the stickiness of his portal by sending users away too quickly. He failed to see the exponential growth of the web, where manual curation would soon become impossible, and missed Metcalfe's law, which dictates that the value of a network scales exponentially with its users. Backrub became Google, now worth trillions, while Excite collapsed. To combat linear bias, one must visualize data. Graphing relationships often reveals the true nature of a curve that raw numbers hide. Using extreme data points, like the 100% daily interest rate in the penny example, can also make power laws obvious. By consistently assessing problems through the lens of nonlinearity, whether in the cockpit or the boardroom, One can anticipate the outsized impacts of small changes and avoid the catastrophic stalls that come from assuming the world moves in a straight line. Chapter 3. Learned Lessons. The late afternoon sun over Nangarhar Province, Afghanistan, was fading into a dusty haze as two F-16s raced toward a pinned-down convoy of U.S. Army Rangers. After hours of patrol, the pilots arrived just in time to drop 500-pound GPS-guided bombs on ISIS machine gun nests, buying the Rangers maneuvering room. However, with bombs expended and enemy snipers still engaging, the pilots switched to laser-guided rockets, a new weapon system originally designed for helicopters. The squadron had scrambled to learn the system mid-deployment, even resorting to tricking the jet's computer into accepting them. Diving toward the target, the pilot pickled a rocket, guiding it with a cursor to a direct hit, a shack. As dusk fell and the weather worsened in the valley, the F-16 was Remington, out of everything but the gun. Strafing with the gun is the most demanding skill for a pilot, requiring precise stick and rudder flying just 100 feet above unforgiving terrain. Unlike smart weapons, the gun demands an intuitive grasp of complex geometry and physics. Pilots learn this through heuristics, mental shortcuts like canopy codes, that simplify calculations into visual cues. With muzzle flashes visible below, the pilot executed a manual strafing run, threading the needle between rising terrain and cloud layers. He fired a burst of 20mm rounds, destroying the enemy position, then pulled hard to clear a ridge gap. Moments later, fuel critical, bingo, he made one final, high-risk pass on a remaining machine gun nest before rocketing upward to a waiting tanker. This ability to execute complex, high-stakes decisions is honed through rigorous training exercises like Red Flag. Born from the high casualty rates of the Vietnam War, Red Flag provides realistic combat simulations in the Nevada desert. Here, pilots face aggressor squadrons and integrated threats, learning to function in the fog of war. The training emphasizes decision-making over rote skill. In one notable failure during a large-scale mission to rescue a downed pilot, the mission commander, the author, chose to execute despite incomplete information. The result was a mission failure and a simulated loss of a helicopter. Such failures are dissected in brutal, rank-agnostic debriefs, where every mistake is analyzed to prevent recurrence. This culture of extreme accountability and learning from error is what sharpens a pilot's judgment. Applying these lessons to training the next generation of pilots for the F-35, a trillion-dollar program critical to future air superiority, required a pedagogical shift. The training philosophy moved away from memorizing facts to understanding concepts. Pilots were taught the why behind systems, encouraged to ask questions, and coached rather than merely evaluated. Training was customized to the learner, focusing on concepts over rote data, much like a tree where deep understanding, trunk branches, supports specific facts, leaves. Technology also played a pivotal role. Recognizing the law of diminishing returns with expensive, high-fidelity simulators, the program introduced a spectrum of devices: laptops for procedural training, VR headsets for immersive practice, and high-end domes for complex tactical scenarios. This allowed students to learn at their own pace and arrive at the expensive simulators already proficient in basics. The result was a faster, more effective training pipeline that produced pilots capable of divergent thinking, solving novel problems in dynamic environments rather than just recalling textbook answers. Ultimately, the fighter pilot's edge comes from the debrief. Whether after a training flight or a combat mission, the relentless pursuit of the root cause of errors, failure to assess, choose, or execute, builds a robust mental framework. By treating every flight as a data point for improvement, pilots transform raw experience into wisdom, creating a web of instincts that allows for split-second decisions when lives are on the line. This system of learning, prioritizing concepts, leveraging technology, and embracing honest critique is applicable far beyond the cockpit, offering a blueprint for mastering complexity in any field. Chapter 4. Fast Forecasting. High above Parwan province in Afghanistan at 2 of the Hindu Kush. Returning from a 5-hour strike mission against the Taliban, the F-16 flight lead and his wingman, callsign Shark, were exhausted, their bodies running on the fading effects of military-issued stimulants. They were preparing for one of the most dangerous phases of flight, landing a high-performance fighter jet at night in mountainous terrain. The environment was unforgiving, with peaks reaching 25,000 feet, and a runway altitude that demanded a landing speed of 175 miles per hour, pushing the limits of the aircraft's brakes. To complicate matters, the primary runway was closed, forcing them to aim for a shorter, narrower strip, and they were carrying unexpended heavy munitions. Lacking a viable backup airfield, due to a lack of coordination with nearby Kabul, the pilots had committed to burning extra fuel to lighten their aircraft for landing, a calculated risk that left them with a razor-thin margin of safety. As the flight lead initiated his afterburner to burn off the excess fuel, creating a 30-foot flame behind his jet, he flipped down his night vision goggles. Bagram appeared as a sprawling armored city, a high-tech landfill of overlapping infrastructure illuminated against the hostile countryside. The descent seemed routine until strange, glowing orange ropes began climbing into the sky. It took a moment for the pilot's brain to process the visual anomaly not as sweat in his eyes, but as the base's defensive anti-mortar systems activating. The C-RAM cannons were weaving a tapestry of tracer fire and high-explosive detonations to intercept incoming projectiles. The silence of the cockpit was broken by the tower controller's urgent command to abort the landing because the runway had been hit. Reacting on instinct to avoid stalling low to the ground, the pilot slammed the throttle to full afterburner and pulled the aircraft into a vertical climb, escaping the immediate danger of the ground and the friendly fire from the base's defenses. Safe at altitude but critically low on fuel, the pilots faced a dire predicament. They were below their bingo fuel, the minimum required to reach a tanker or alternate base, and trapped above a base under attack with no clear place to land. This crisis demanded immediate, high-stakes decision-making, a process that boils down to betting on the outcome of a choice based on expected value. To find the expected value, one must weigh the probability of the upside against the probability of the downside. However, in the chaos of the real world, precise numbers are rarely available, a dilemma known as the base of sand problem. The solution is a technique called fast forecasting, which relies on extrapolating intuition to create a rough mental model. By simplifying a complex system down to its driving variables, much like recognizing that speed is the exponential factor in ejection survival, or time is the driver of compound interest, a decision-maker can prioritize accuracy over precision. Using fast forecasting, the pilot rapidly evaluated his limited options. The first option was to land on the damaged runway. Knowing the runway's dimensions and estimating the blast radius of a mortar shell, he calculated a roughly 6% chance of hitting a crater, and perhaps a 50% chance that hitting it would cause a catastrophic cartwheel. This left a 97% probability of survival, a terrifyingly low margin in peacetime, but a viable one in combat. The second option was ejection, which carried a similar survival rate but a guaranteed loss of the aircraft and a high risk of severe injury or capture. A third option, a maximum range climb to a distant base, was mathematically impossible given their fuel state. This left a final dynamic possibility, an airborne tanker located 80 miles away. Standard procedure dictated flying to meet the tanker, but they lacked the fuel to return if the rendezvous failed. However, by flying a slower, fuel-conserving intercept profile, they could meet the tanker partway while preserving just enough gas to glide back to the damaged runway if necessary. The pilot chose the hybrid tanker option. He radioed his wingman and turned toward the distant radar contact, knowing that any error in the fuel gauges or the intercept geometry would force them to eject over the jagged, enemy-held mountains. As the tanker came into view, the pilot executed a precise rendezvous, drifting into position just as his fuel state became critical. The refueling process, a delicate manual maneuver performed at 350 miles per hour, required nerves of steel. The boom operator plugged into the fighter, and fuel began to flow, saving the aircraft. Meanwhile, on the ground, explosive ordnance teams cleared the runway, finding a crater that was quickly patched. The pilots eventually landed safely, having survived a cascading series of threats through rapid, calculated judgment. This incident illustrates why humans remain superior decision-makers in chaotic environments. While computers can process trillions of operations per second, they rely on statistical regressions and correlations that fail when patterns change. Humans, conversely, seek causation and can adapt to novel situations using efficient mental models. We utilize tools like data visualization, graphs that reveal power laws and tipping points to process complex relationships instantly. We employ mental math tricks, like staking, to extrapolate answers from known data points without getting bogged down in complex calculations. This ability to fast forecasts to generate a rough but logical solution on the fly allows leaders to avoid the paralysis of analysis. It encourages critical thinking and ownership, ensuring that decisions are not blindly handed off to algorithms or committees, but are made with conviction based on a deep conceptual understanding of the world. By embracing uncertainty and focusing on the few variables that truly matter, one can navigate even the most desperate scenarios. Having established how to choose the best option based on expected value, the challenge shifts to expanding the decision-making space itself. The next phase of the process explores how to move beyond selecting from existing choices and instead develop novel, non-traditional options that possess the power to provide more effective solutions. Chapter 5. Creativity. On the afternoon of January 16, 1991, a dusty rental car raced across the tarmac of a desolate was formidable, but planners had identified a vulnerability. If they could destroy specific early warning radar sites on the border, they could blind the system and create a corridor for the air armada. The challenge lay in destroying these sites without alerting them, a paradox that ruled out conventional bombers or fighters, which would be detected long before they could release their weapons. The solution to this tactical puzzle emerged not from a general strategy room, but from a chance encounter in a hallway involving a young helicopter pilot named Randy O'Boyle. When a planner expressed the need to neutralize the radars covertly, O'Boyle suggested an unconventional alliance between Air Force Special Operations and the Army. His idea was to pair the navigationally superior NH-53 Pave-Low helicopters, which could fly blind in the dark using terrain-following radar and GPS, with the heavy firepower of Army AH-64 Apaches. This concept, eventually codenamed Task Force Normandy, faced immense skepticism and logistical hurdles, including the need to dangerously overload the Apaches with extra fuel tanks to extend their range. Yet, it proceeded because it focused on the desired effect rather than traditional doctrine. Under the cover of a moonless night, the mixed force of helicopters infiltrated Iraqi airspace, flying 50 feet off the ground in total radio silence. At the precise moment, the Apaches unleashed a torrent of Hellfire missiles and Hydra rockets, obliterating the radar sites. The code words California Alpha and Nevada Alpha were radioed back, signaling total destruction. Moments later, the night sky filled with the lights of hundreds of coalition jets streaming through the newly created gap, effectively winning the war in its opening minutes. This operation exemplifies a decision-making framework known as effects-based operations, a mindset that prioritizes the desired outcome over the specific tools or processes used to achieve it. In traditional warfare, as in many business structures, the tendency is to match force against force, tank against tank, product against product. Effects-based operations, however, deconstruct the enemy or the problem as a system of relationships. By identifying the critical nodes within that system, one can apply leverage where it will have an exponential impact. The planners of Desert Storm did not ask how to win a dogfight against Iraqi interceptors. They asked how to blind the enemy so the dogfight never happened. This approach requires working backward from the end state, stripping away preconceived notions about which tools are appropriate, and focusing entirely on what will generate the necessary result. It is a method that demands divergent thinking, forcing decision-makers to look beyond the obvious linear solutions and find asymmetric advantages. The necessity of this creative flexibility was starkly illustrated nearly a decade later during the air war over Serbia, where the failure to innovate led to a shocking loss for the United States. The F-117 Nighthawk, the world's premier stealth fighter, was considered invincible, having flown with impunity over Baghdad. However, NATO planners had become complacent, flying the same routes at the same times, relying entirely on the technology of stealth rather than creative tactics. On the ground, a Serbian missile commander named Zoltan Dani displayed the ingenuity the Americans lacked. Operating obsolete 1950s-era radar systems, Dani modified his equipment to operate on frequencies that could detect the faint disturbance of the stealth aircraft. He used spies to spot takeoffs, moved his batteries constantly to avoid destruction, and baited NATO forces with decoys. On a night when weather grounded the F-117's escorts, Dani ambushed Colonel Dale Zelko, shooting down the invisible jet. Dani succeeded because he understood the power of creativity to close a technological gap, while the NATO forces failed because they relied on a static, linear assessment of their own superiority. Creativity, therefore, is not merely an artistic flourish, but a functional necessity in high-stakes environments characterized by uncertainty. It involves connecting disparate concepts to solve problems in non-traditional ways. This was evident in the asymmetric defense of Ukraine, where a smaller force utilized commercial drones, social media narratives, and agile tactics to stymie a larger, more rigid Russian military. Whether in the cockpit or the boardroom, the ability to generate alternatives is paramount. By breaking a problem down into the specific effects required, rather than the tools available, and then brainstorming solutions that satisfy those effects, leaders can uncover options that others miss. This process transforms decision-making from a selection between known variables into the creation of new possibilities, leveraging the chaotic nature of reality to gain an outsized advantage. With the problem assessed and a creative course of action chosen, the final and perhaps most difficult phase remains. A brilliant plan is useless without the capacity to implement it amidst the friction of the real world. The focus must now shift to the mechanics of execution, exploring how to prioritize tasks, manage mental bandwidth, and overcome the physiological and psychological barriers that arise when the pressure mounts and the plan meets reality. Chapter 6: Mental Toughness. The high-stakes world of modern combat requires more than just skill and equipment. It demands an extraordinary level of mental fortitude. This was starkly illustrated during a mission in Afghanistan's Nangarhar province, where U.S. Special Forces were conducting a high-risk clearing operation against ISIS fighters entrenched near the Pakistani border. The rules of engagement were restrictive to protect civilians, meaning NATO forces often had to wait to be fired upon before engaging. The air support plan involved a mix of assets, but as the only fighter squadron in the country, F-16s like the authors were a critical, scarce resource. When an ambush broke out, the author and his wingman scrambled, launching in full afterburner to relieve aircraft running low on fuel. Arriving overhead, they found a chaotic battle space. Army Apaches, low on fuel, were checking off station, leaving a significant gap in close air support. The AC-130 gunship, a flying battleship, remained, but the situation on the ground was deteriorating. The combat controller's voice, usually calm, betrayed the tension as friendly forces took accurate fire. The fear of fratricide, accidentally killing friendly troops, loomed large. A modern fighter pilot wields immense power. A single bomb can obliterate everything within hundreds of feet, amplifying the weight of every decision. The pilots coordinated with the controller, dropping 500-pound bombs on sniper positions and engaging in a complex dance with the AC-130, which was firing incessantly despite losing its radios. The stress of combat has a physiological cost. As the amygdala senses danger, it floods the body with adrenaline and cortisol, preparing for fight or flight, but shutting down the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational decision-making. This biological reaction can reduce a pilot's functional IQ by 20 points, turning simple tasks into insurmountable hurdles. The author recounts a training flight where a student pilot, overwhelmed by a minor radio error, spiraled into erratic flying, demonstrating how quickly mental composure can unravel. This snowball effect is a common failure mode in high-pressure environments where emotions hijack logic. Recognizing this vulnerability, the Air Force began treating mental toughness not as an innate trait, but as a trainable skill. Drawing on his background as a collegiate boxer, the author understood that physical preparation must be matched by mental conditioning. Techniques like visualization, self-talk, and controlled breathing, specifically nasal breathing to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, were integrated into pilot training. This focus-based training aimed to keep the mind in the present, preventing the brain from wasting bandwidth on past mistakes or future worries. The mission in Afghanistan culminated in a critical decision point. With the AC-130 out of ammo and the troops pinned down by a fortified compound, the author was down to his last weapon, a massive 2,000-pound bomb. Dropping it would put the friendly forces well within the danger-close radius, risking their lives. However, doing nothing likely meant they would be overrun. Using a mental chart of probabilities, the author calculated the risk, coordinated with the ground commander, and released the weapon. The bomb destroyed the compound without harming the friendlies, a testament to the necessity of making calculated, high-risk decisions under extreme pressure. This experience reinforced the value of the mental toughness program developed for F-35 pilots. By teaching students to regulate their emotions, reframe negative thoughts, and visualize success through chair flying, the Air Force significantly reduced washout rates. The program proved that mental resilience is a skill that can be honed, allowing pilots and professionals in other high-stress fields to maintain peak performance when it matters most. The ability to control one's mind in the face of fear and chaos is the ultimate force multiplier, ensuring that when the fog of war descends, the operator remains clear-headed and effective. Chapter 7. Prioritize him, but it was too late. Ahmad detonated his vest, sending shrapnel ripping through the gathered runners, killing 4 Americans and wounding 17 others. Across the runway, the author, awakened by the blast and the ensuing cavalry charge alarm, was thrust into a chaotic aftermath. The base locked down, grounding all flights and creating an eerie silence. However, intelligence soon indicated a complex, multi-pronged attack was underway, necessitating the launch of F-16s to defend the perimeter. As the author and his wingman prepared to launch, they faced a new threat: a rusted fuel truck barreling toward their aircraft on the ramp. In a split-second decision driven by the potential for a massive vehicle-borne IED, the author chose to launch immediately, rather than wait for security, prioritizing the survival of his team and the mission over procedure. The truck driver was later detained by maintainers, and while no explosives were found, the incident highlighted the necessity of rapid, decisive action in ambiguous situations. This need for prioritization is not unique to combat. It is a fundamental skill for effective leadership, exemplified by General Dwight D. Eisenhower during World War II. Facing the immense pressure of Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion involving 160,000 troops and thousands of ships, Eisenhower had to make the most consequential decision of the 20th century based on imperfect information about the weather. A massive storm threatened to scuttle the invasion, which would have delayed the war by weeks and potentially fractured the Allied coalition. Eisenhower's genius lay in his ability to categorize tasks using what is now known as the Eisenhower matrix, separating the urgent from the important. The matrix divides tasks into 4 quadrants. 1. Urgent and important. Quadrant 1. Crises that demand immediate attention, like a cockpit fire or a heart attack. These are near rocks that must be addressed instantly to survive. 2. Important but not urgent. Quadrant 2. Strategic planning, relationship building, and long-term goals. These are far rocks that prevent future crises but are often neglected because they lack immediate deadlines. Eisenhower's decision to launch the invasion during a brief weather window fell here. It was the single most critical decision, requiring deep focus amidst a storm of lesser demands. Number 3. Urgent but not important. Quadrant 3. Interruptions, emails, and meetings that feel pressing but do not contribute to long-term goals. This is the urgency effect trap, where busy work masquerades as productivity. Eisenhower delegated these tasks. 4. Not urgent and not important. Quadrant 4. Distractions and time wasters. These should be eliminated entirely. By ruthlessly prioritizing the important over the urgent, Eisenhower cleared his mental bandwidth to make the go-no-go decision for D-Day. Once the order was given, okay, we'll go, he famously detached from the situation, playing board games and writing a letter accepting full responsibility in case of failure. This ability to compartmentalize and rest allowed him to maintain the mental stamina required for the long campaign ahead. For modern leaders and decision-makers, the lesson is clear. Success depends on the ability to filter noise. Whether in a cockpit facing a potential suicide bomber or in a boardroom navigating a crisis, the overwhelming influx of data must be triaged. One must resist the siren song of the urgent but unimportant to focus on the few critical decisions that truly matter. Technology can aid in offloading Quadrant 3 tasks, but the discipline to prioritize Quadrant 2, strategic thinking and preparation, must come from the individual. Ultimately, decisiveness is not about having perfect information, but about making the best possible choice with the information available, accepting the risk, and executing with conviction. This framework of assess, choose, and execute, the ACE Helix, provides a roadmap for navigating the complexities of the modern world. From understanding power laws and leveraging creativity to building mental toughness and prioritizing ruthlessly, these principles empower individuals to move from reactive survival to proactive mastery. The goal is not to eliminate uncertainty, but to thrive within it, using every decision as a stepping stone toward a clearly defined objective. As the author concludes, knowledge is only potential power. It becomes actual power only when applied under pressure to solve real-world problems.